You're listening to Foreseeable, a production of Global is Asian, the flagship thought leadership digital platform of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Each episode, we invite an expert for a conversation relating to their field of study or experience and to find out what they foresee happening in the future. Professor Eduardo Araral is a distinguished academic and practitioner with over 30 years of experience in academia and government. His research primarily focuses on institutions for collective action. As a prominent figure in the field, Professor Araral has contributed to significant projects with various governments and international organizations, including the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. He is engaged in over 250 executive education programs, sharing his insights with thousands of government officials, business leaders, and NGOs across more than 50 countries. In this discussion, we explore his perspectives on the pressing challenges facing Indonesia, Southeast Asia's largest economy, as President Prabowo takes over the country's leadership after being inaugurated as president on 20th October. Professor Araral shares his insights on fiscal policy, infrastructure investment, and the broader implications for governance and public support in a rapidly evolving economic landscape. Okay, thank you. So let's talk about Indonesia today, and I'd really like to hear what you have to say about where you think it's going to go in this new administration. And I'm just going to jump right in and ask you a question. What do you think motivated President Prabowo's administration to consider increasing Indonesia's debt to GDP ratio to 50% and budget deficit to 5%? What's behind that?
Yeah, David, thanks for having me. The main motivation, I think, from President Prabowo, and he has mentioned this repeatedly in public, is that one, he wants the Indonesian economy to grow at least 8% on a sustainable basis, such that by 2045, that's the 100-year anniversary of Indonesia as a republic, with that 8% growth, Indonesia would become a middle-income country. So that's the first and foremost motivation, 8% growth. And to achieve that growth, you need to have an expansionary fiscal policy. That means Indonesia will spend more, increase its debt to GDP ratio, increase its budget deficit, because to achieve that 8% growth requires a lot of spending for infrastructure, for the new capital, for social spending, healthcare spending, housing, and all the things that President Prabowo promised during his election.
Mm-hmm. And how does this stance compare to other ASEAN countries and developed economies, especially in terms of the debt to GDP and budget deficit?
Among ASEAN countries and OECD countries, Indonesia actually has a very conservative budget deficit and debt to GDP ratio. And partly that is, or mainly that is because of its bad experience in the late 1990s when the Indonesian economy collapsed because of unregulated and uncontrolled borrowing and so on. So compared to ASEAN, Indonesia has a lot of fiscal space. For example, the Indonesia's debt to GDP ratio is only about close to 40%. Compare that to the Philippines, it's close to about 60%. Indonesia's budget deficit at 2.5%. That's still pretty low compared to the average of about 5% in other ASEAN countries. And Indonesia, compared to OECD and EU countries, is still very low. In EU, the debt to GDP ratio would be about 90%. Compared to France and Italy, Indonesia's debt to GDP ratio looks very small. In short, David, Indonesia has a lot of fiscal space and a lot of room to grow in its fiscal expansion.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that 8% growth target. How realistic do you think that is?
It's not impossible, but it's difficult because right now Indonesia is only growing at about 5%. And it's a big economy. It's 1.2 trillion US dollars. So anything that grows 8% at 1.3 trillion dollars is already very significant. But there is room for growth because one, it is a young population. Number two, It is blessed with a lot of natural resources, especially nickel and all the rare earth that goes into all these cars. Number three, Indonesia has a lot of resources for coal, natural resources like oil and gas. I think they have a newly discovered field and is also looking to export its industries. And Indonesia has also a lot of unicorns, Gojek, Tokopedia, and all of the stuff. So the fundamentals for Indonesia's growth would be there. It just needs a little bit more push to move from 5% to 8%.
Okay. I definitely get the point. They have that fiscal space to grow compared to other countries. But I'd like to ask you now, what are the potential benefits of raising the tax to GDP ratio from 10.6 to 16%? And how does this align Indonesia with its regional peers?
If Indonesia moves from 11% or to 16% tax to GDP ratio, that would align it closely to its ASEAN peers. The average will be about 15.5% for ASEAN. So Indonesia is way below compared to its peers. In numerical terms, that means Indonesia could earn an additional 100 billion US dollars in tax revenues if it can change its tax to GDP ratio from 11% to 16%. And what that means is that with this additional $100 billion a year, then it could pay more for its food program, housing program, water program, poverty alleviation program, defense modernization, the new capital, and all other expenditure items that Indonesia needs to grow at 8%.
Definitely a real growth potential here. But can you walk us through maybe some different scenarios that you've spoken about in the past for Indonesia's fiscal future, maybe from the gradual growth to rapid or shock increases in debt and deficit?
So I wrote a paper that got published in a couple of Indonesian newspapers where I laid out three scenarios for fiscal expansion for Indonesia. The first one is slow and moderate expansion, which means a 2 to 3% fiscal expansion on its budget deficit, right? And its debt to GDP ratio. In this scenario, my conclusion is that this is feasible. It will not have any high risk to the Indonesian economy in terms of inflation, in terms of credit downgrade, and in terms of weakening the market sentiment. But it would have some effect on pressures on the rupiah. So a growth of 2 to 3% year in, year out, this would be your debt to GDP ratio. Currently, it's about close to 40%. So if it grows about 2 to 3% every year, couple of years, then that should still be okay. And Indonesia would hit its debt to GDP ratio of 48%, which is still way, way below compared to what the law says in Indonesia and way below compared to OECD countries and in line with ASEAN countries. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario, David, is a fast growth, a 3 to 4% growth of debt to GDP ratio, which means that within 4 years' time, the Indonesia's debt to GDP ratio will grow fast, and this would be a bit risky for the economy in terms of inflation, in terms of its currency, in terms of its credit rating, and so on. But if this is accompanied by high levels of tax collection, then this is also good for Indonesia. So there's got to be a balancing act between the speed of fiscal expansion and the speed at which they collect new taxes. And then the last scenario I wrote was about a really rapid increase, which is after 1 or 2 years, Indonesia shoots for 5% debt to GDP ratio, and that would really make it difficult. And the economy has to grow. Otherwise, if the economy doesn't grow very fast, then the debt growth would overtake the growth of the economy, and that could be detrimental for its inflation, for its currency, its credit rating, and market sentiment. But fortunately, just I read in the news today that President Prabowo has sealed a partnership with the largest political party in Indonesia. So practically, there are no more opposition parties in Indonesia. It will become a supermajority, and which means that the Prabowo administration can push for changing the ceiling on debt to GDP ratio, that currently 3% ceiling, so that they can probably increase it to 5%. And this will give a lot of space for President Prabowo to push ahead with his fiscal expansionary plans.
And you outlined the risks of those different scenarios as you were speaking, but is there any other risk on the horizon for the Indonesian economy that you see as being the main concern?
Yes, one is the oil price shock.
Mm,
If this war in the Middle East escalates and the oil refineries in Iran would be targeted and the shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf would be affected, oil prices would go up, energy prices would go up, and that would have a knock-on effect on the Indonesian economy. Although Indonesia also produces oil, but that's not enough. Number two is the continuing war in Ukraine, which means that fertilizer prices will continue to increase because Ukraine is and Russia are two major exporters of fertilizers, which Indonesia needs as still an agriculture dependent country. And Indonesia is the world's largest producer of palm oil, which requires all of those fertilizer from Ukraine. So those are just two shocks. The third one, of course, is if President Trump wins and he will make good of his promise to impose a 60% tariff for Chinese goods and 10% across the board for every country. That would also affect Indonesia because Indonesia also exports a lot to the United States. And when that happens, we expect to see inflation go back to the United States. And when that inflation goes back, then the cost of borrowing for the rest of the world would also go up. And that would also affect Indonesia. And the cost of borrowing in Indonesia, like any other country, would also go up. And that would also slow down private sector investments. And that would also crowd out the government or would also be competing with the private sector when interest rates go up. So those are the three scenarios of risks that are highly plausible for Indonesia.
hmm Yeah, those are very big risks and very dramatic ones. But are there other global economic conditions that influence Indonesia's ability to manage its increased debt and achieve its targeted growth rates?
Yeah, apart from those three things that I already mentioned, of course, the US-China competition would be one thing, but it's not always a negative thing for Indonesia. In fact, Indonesia is now a main beneficiary of this US-China rivalry as a lot of Chinese companies move to Southeast Asia and principally to Indonesia. And so all of this US imposed and EU imposed tariffs on BYD and Chinese electric vehicles, Indonesia is the main beneficiary. And you see that a lot of Chinese companies move down south to Indonesia to set up their plants and take advantage of Indonesia's availability of these mineral goods and use Indonesia as an export base to export Chinese cars so that they don't get slapped. Imagine if President Trump wins or even President Kamala Harris, they would continue with President Biden's 60% tariff on electric cars, right? But if the cars are produced in Indonesia with a combination of Indonesian content, EU content, with Chinese technology and all the stuff, then it's no longer subject to the usual 60%, maybe 10%, yes. We don't know how that will go, but so Indonesia, in effect, would become a major beneficiary of US-China trade war.
That's interesting. They have the U.S.-China relationship, and then, as you were saying earlier, the mineral wealth, the nickel and other minerals that are important for electric cars. So that's an interesting scenario going forward in that space. But you also mentioned that now with the political situation, President Prabowo should be able to increase the borrowing as he plans. But are there measures that Indonesia can take to ensure that this increased borrowing is used effectively for growth enhancing projects?
Yes, there's a lot of things that the administration can do. The first one, of course, is Minister Sri Mulya, the outgoing finance minister of Indonesia, has been very good in shepherding the Indonesian economy, and she's a fiscal conservative, and she knows that the fiscal space or borrowing goes too much, then that would be dangerous for the economy. So one of the things that the government can do is, of course, channel this fiscal space, this extra money into productive investments. One of those would be on this feeding program, national feeding program, that was a campaign promise of President Prabowo. If that is done well, that means it would boost the growth of small and medium enterprises with a lot of money feeding a lot of young children. This could boost the growth of SMEs, and that would be good for the Indonesian economies, which relies a lot on SME growth. And if we have growing SMEs, then you can also increase the taxes paid by these SMEs. So it's a positive feedback loop. Number two is investments in productive assets like transportation, education, irrigation, renewable electricity, and so on. And as long as this money is put into productive investments, they will pay for it for their own. They will have a lot of multiplier effect, not just immediately, but even in the long run. So as long as the GDP is growing at a rapid pace and at a pace greater than your borrowing, then that should be also good. I'm only worried about if this expenditure goes to elephant unproductive projects or goes to corruption. But I think President Prabowo is watching that. He doesn't want to be remembered probably in Indonesian history as having been given this opportunity to lead the country only to let it go to waste. So I think he's got an eye for his history because he's not already young. I think he will try to be seen as the president who delivered on the promise of 8% growth and putting Indonesia on the trajectory as an upper middle income country by 2045.
Okay, you laid out quite a few possibilities there, but how do you actually foresee Indonesia balancing this need for aggressive fiscal expansion, but with the necessity of maintaining economic stability? Do you have a prediction?
For Indonesia, what President Prabowo needs to do is to assure the stakeholders, global stakeholders, that while he will do fiscal expansion, there will also be fiscal discipline and fiscal consolidation down the road. So that people will not be worried that there is no limit, that this fiscal expansion would be unlimited. Indexation, productive investments, there has to be some restrictions on how far he could go to borrowing. Probably not exceed 60%, 50% should be okay. And the 3% limit that he will lift, if that goes to 5%, should still be okay. The bottom line, David, is his communications team and himself would have to assure the market that these conditions are in place. Otherwise, the market could panic if they are not told what the plans would be. David?
You have spoken about where a lot of this money is going to go already, but what role does infrastructure investment play in this whole scenario and the plan to boost productivity and achieve this long-term economic growth?
David, it's infrastructure that really drives the growth of the economy. So you put in your railways, then people can move faster, goods and can move faster. You build your seaports, and Indonesia has 17,000 islands. If they can improve their seaport, then the cost of logistics and cost of doing business would go down, and that would be good for the SMEs. That would be good for inflation. That would be good for economic growth. You build more roads and highways outside of Jakarta. You build them in the outlying islands or in Sumatra. Then that would also spread out growth outside of the Jakarta region. So, David, the bottom line is infrastructure investment has a lot of multiplier effect on the economy. It creates jobs, crowd in investments. It is productive investments, and it's a main driver for economic growth.
Okay, thank you so much. I think finally, I'd like to wrap it up by asking about the political and social implications of all these fiscal policy changes, especially concerning the public support and potential economic inequality.
Uh, on the inequality part, so President Prabowo promised the feeding program. So that is really good to help malnourished children improve education, also improve the SMEs. So that's really good. That's front and center of his campaign promise. As a military man, he knows logistics. He knows how to deliver goods. And even as we speak, that is already happening. So I think that promise on feeding program will be delivered. On the fiscal expansion side, I think he's got a lot of very smart advisors. They know that a 5% shock growth, shock fiscal expansion would be risky. So they might probably go for 3 to 4% manageable growth so that it will not really lead to a shock in the system that will lead to inflation, credit rating, and market sentiment analysis. So I think President Prabowo is like a juggler in the circus. He's juggling many things. He's got plenty of smart advisors, and I think he's willing to listen, and they will have to monitor how things are and make some corrections and adjustments as needed.
What gives you the most hope about the economic situation going forward?
Of course, Indonesia is the biggest economy in the region, right? 1.3 trillion. If something bad happens to Indonesia, everybody gets sick. So we have to be hopeful and helpful to Indonesia. But being hopeful and helpful are two different things. Whether they can pull off and deliver this promised things is another thing, right? And I already said that I think the feeding program is good to go. It will happen. The infrastructure spending is already happening. Indonesia is already on a high-level trajectory. Indonesia is joining OECD. Once you join OECD, you are subject to all the requirements, regulations, stipulations, and standards of OECD. That means you cannot have lack of discipline or fiscal space and all that stuff. You have to be compliant with OECD rules. And that gives me comfort that under OECD standards, Indonesia will not become like the old Indonesia before that there were no limits and restrictions. And number three, why I'm optimistic, David, as I mentioned to this, is that President Prabowo has tried 3 times for this presidency. And I don't think he would like to squander this opportunity, last opportunity for him to be a great Indonesian leader. And he's got his plans well laid out. He has thought through this. He's got a solid majority in parliament. There's no meaningful opposition for him. And he's got a lot of very smart advisors. And I think he knows how to listen. So that gives me optimism why these things should go through.
Very good. Thank you so much. That's really a really positive and interesting picture you've painted of Indonesia under this new administration and what we have to look forward to. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to subscribe to the Globalization newsletter, look for the link in the description or find us on Facebook at Global is Asian.